I am very excited to welcome Elissa Altman to discuss her new book, Permission. Elissa Altman is an award-winning author of the memoirs Motherland, Trafe, and Poor Man's Feast, and the best-selling essay Substack of the same name. A longtime editor, she has been a finalist for the Lambda Literary Award, Connecticut Book Award, Maine Literary Award, and the Frank McCourt Memoir Prize. And her work has appeared in publications such as Orion, The Bitter Southerner, On Being, O, The Oprah Magazine, LitHub, The Wall Street Journal, The Guardian, and The Washington Post, where her column Feeding My Mother ran for a year. Altman writes and speaks widely on the intersection of permission, storytelling, and creativity, and has appeared live on the TEDx stage and at the Public Theater in New York. Altman will be in conversation with Brittany Kerfoot. Brittany is the former events director for Politics and Prose. She holds a variety of positions, including writing and literature instructor for Politics and Prose bookstore, advisory board member for the Alan Chuse International Writers Center, and co-producer and host of Generation Women DC, a new storytelling series in the district that celebrates women and non-binary performers of all ages. So please join me in welcoming Elissa Altman and Brittany Kerfoot to Politics and Prose.
Hi, everyone. Welcome.
Hi, everybody. Hello. Hello.
So the way we'll kind of do tonight's event is we'll get a little background on the book for those who haven't read it or don't know what it's about. And Elissa will read a bit, and then we'll have a conversation. And then at the end, I would love if any of you have any questions. Someone will come around with a mic so everyone can hear you and we get it on video. So think of any questions you have as we're talking. But first, tell us a little bit about the book. What was the catalyst to you writing it? Give us some context about what the meat of it is really about for those who don't know.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for joining me, and thank you all for being here. So good to see all of you, and so good to see some of my students here. So it's just wonderful, amazing novelists sitting in the first row. And this is kind of a quirky story, and it is a cautionary tale. I think it can only be described as a cautionary tale. So in 2013, I wrote what I thought was a fairly innocuous memoir called Poor Man's Feast, and it was a linear love story about how I met Susan, who was filming me right now. How I met her, and she lived in northern rural Connecticut. I lived in the city in Manhattan, and it was about the year that it took me to make the decision to leave my studio apartment on East 57th Street and move to her tiny town of 3,500. And you know, a lot of food in it. I was a food writer. We did a lot of cooking. There was a dog involved, and and a lot of gardening, and sort of pleasant. But there was an undercurrent in the book of there was a question that ran through the book, which was how do we find sustenance? Where do we find sustenance? What does sustenance mean to us? So for some of us, it's food, and it's really sort of basic, and for most of us, but it can also mean music, and it can also mean art. It can also mean family. It can mean gardening. It can mean walking. It can mean any of those things. And for me, I wanted to unpack the story behind why I had become a food writer. My mother is a terrible cook. She doesn't really cook very much anymore, but she is. My father used to say that he divorced her because she was so religious. Every meal she made was a sacrifice or a burnt offering. She's a terrible, terrible cook. So I didn't get it from her. But my dad was a wonderful cook and very sort of emotionally generous and giving, and loved to feed people and loved to take care of people. But I couldn't figure out how he had come to it, because he was born in 1923. He was raised during the Depression. in Brooklyn, New York. And so I started unpacking, and I realized that the core of the story was wrapped around a story of my grandmother, of my paternal grandmother, who was about this big, and about this very large, not a petite person, a very good cook herself. And in 1926, when my father was 3 and my aunt was 8, walked out on them. And that was unheard of. I mean, it was unheard of. I mean, women, of course, did it under all kinds of difficult situations. But she walked out on her very young son, my dad, and her daughter, and my grandfather. And she came back 3 years later, but those 3 years changed my father completely. They changed him at the cellular level. And he and my aunt were in an orphanage for a little while. They were boarders in someone else's home with my grandfather. And my father used to talk about this all the time when I was a little girl. This was how he, whether appropriate, inappropriate, whatever, but he talked about it all the time. And it was as if I was sort of his emotional sounding board. And I grew up with a really bad abandonment complex because I assumed then that this is something that's a possibility for mothers, and that my mother could go out to have her nails done and not come back. That was within the realm of possibility. And so the story sort of followed me everywhere. We would be walking the dog and he would be talking about it. We would be going for a walk through Central Park and he would be talking about it. And I never told him to stop because I could see sort of the anguish on his face. And he and I were extremely close. I adored him. And so I wrote that towards the end of the book, there were 8 lines towards the back of the book in which I reveal that my grandmother had walked out. And from that point forward, my father experienced a sense of yearning and need for comfort and sustenance and love and care and all of those things that he didn't get in the years that she was gone. And it followed him through the rest of his life. And it trickled down to me. So I learned how to cook from him. I learned the importance of having people around your table from him. I learned the concept of breaking bread with people from him. And so I wrote this in, again, a heartbreaking section of the book, but that explains where it came from for me. So the book comes out, and about 3 or 4 months later, I'm attending a family wedding in Michigan. And one of my cousins, who is not here tonight, that's nice, not here. One of my cousins follows me to the ladies' room down this very private hallway, and I hear clack, 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 clack. A tall woman, and I turn around, and she backs me up against the wall of this hallway and says, "It was not your story to tell. We don't love you anymore." And so that began the story. It began the story of my abandonment begetting abandonment. And it almost felt biblical to me, And in fact, there's the story of the Azazel, and whatever background there is always somewhere the scapegoat who was sent away to carry the burdens of the community on their shoulders. And so, somebody who does something wrong or says something wrong or is wrong or any of those things. And so, basically, for the next 10 years, and still to this day, I was excised from that part of my family. And these people, were people I was very close to. They were like siblings to me, spent every holiday with them, and suddenly I didn't, we didn't. And it took me 10 years to get to a place where I could actually talk about it and I could actually write about it. You know, when you experience something like that, there's an enormous amount of shame involved. You start to wonder, you know, oh my God, you know, I should never write again. I can never write again. I can never be a storyteller. And so it was very emotionally challenging, and it really affected everything that I tried to write. And in 2016, I don't know what overcame me, but I sat down and I wrote an essay for Krista Tippett's blog, which was part of her On Being podcast website. And I thought, they'll never publish it. They'll never publish it, and if they publish it, my family's not going to see it, you know. So we were at another wedding, and my phone buzzes, and it's her staff saying, we're publishing it next week, and we're not doing anything to it, you know. And that was really the first time that I spoke publicly about it, talked about it as a thing that every writer, every creative, every art maker has to deal with to some point. This is the elephant in the room, the stories that you want to tell, desperately want to tell, have to tell, and you can't because something or someone, a person, a culture, whatever, says you can't tell it, or else, right? And as time went on, this started to become the focus of the classes that I was teaching, the workshops that I was leading, and little by little, I started writing more and more about it, and that's where permission came from. Permission asks the question: what are the stories that we're allowed to tell, and what are the stories that we're not, and why, and how do we know? And again, not everybody's a memoirist, not everybody's a writer. Painters have this, musicians, artists of every stripe have this to deal with. And so that's where permission came from. It's a long way of explaining it, but that's where it came from.
It's almost as if when your cousin told you didn't have permission to tell that story, you were like, okay, I'm going to tell it louder. Right. Yeah. And the interesting thing is that, this is something that I focus heavily on in the book, is that my father, chewed on it, ruminated on it, metabolized it that way. And even as he did that, his sister, who was 5 years old, was 5 years older than he, hid it from her family. So when Poor Man's Feast came out, her adult children, who were in their 60s, didn't know. And the rest of the family, extended family, didn't know. They just thought everybody was perfect. And, grandmas don't leave. And so I had to sort of contend with the idea that I was sort of like peeling the veneer off this perfect crowd of people. Because we are not perfect people. Humans are not perfect. That's not, it's... I don't know anyone who's perfect, and nor should we be. But that was very, very much a part of the story. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way, right?
Oh, yeah, totally. Yeah.
Okay, before I delve into my questions, I would love for you to read some from the book, because the prose in the book is just really beautiful. And I think it can be hard with nonfiction to make something really engrossing. And I think you've really done that. I mean, by the introduction, I told my husband, I was like, I really love this book. So I would love for you to give everybody else a taste and read a bit.
Okay. So I am going to read a little bit from the introduction, I think. So the introduction is called "There Was a Secret." I did not know that it was a secret, and this not knowing changed my world, tilted it on its axis, spun it like a top. It broke my life and broke my health, and it broke my spirit. It threatened my marriage, I began to stutter the way I had as a child. It altered my creative course, took my humor, rendered me silent for almost a decade. It left me sleepless and afraid. It inflated my ego and then burnt it to ash. It unraveled my understanding of love and tribe and the meaning of grace. Toward the end, when I could no longer do the things that breathe air and light into my days, I couldn't write or work, I couldn't play guitar, I couldn't feed or support myself or the woman I love, I couldn't care for my health or my spirit, and I came close enough to the edge to peer over it. The non-secret secret saved me. Definition: a non-secret secret. A story that everyone knows and everyone hides. A story that everyone knows and pretends never happened. A story that everyone knows and then forgets with the passage of time. A story that some people know and some people don't. A story encased in shame, like a chrysalis. A story that defines and traumatizes generations, past and generations to come, guts them and requires utter allegiance to someone else's truth. Here is a story that had been spoken of daily in my childhood home. I heard it morning and night for almost 18 years until I left for college, and then during college, and again when I returned home. This story had been part of our daily household conversation, like the weather or the news. This story had always been there, like wallpaper. What happens when half a family is devastated by a tragic story and the other half buries it? Like my father, I carried the non-secret secret with me viscerally. It was the basis for every decision that my father made throughout the course of his life, and in the end, it was the story that changed everything I, too, thought about memory, shame, truth, permission, risk, writing, teaching, and making art. Early on, writes Jane Ann Phillips in her essay Outlaw Heart, writers were awarded possession of a set of truths enlisted to protect someone's version, yet we lived in the context of those stories and we understood the truth to shift. And from the earliest days when I imagined that I might become a writer, this was the story that I knew I had to unravel, unpack, attempt to fathom. This was the story that I had to understand in order to keep, paraphrasing Phillips, sorrow from being meaningless. I have been a teacher of memoir now for almost a decade, and every student who attends my workshops first introduces themselves, talks about where they're from and a bit about their background and what they are at work on in their writing lives. And then, without fail, almost every student says that there is something that they want to write about, that they need to write about, but they can't. An impossibility. They would vaporize on the spot, even if this thing they need to write about has defined them and their worldviews, and even if all parties involved are long dead. They'll reason with the gods, they'll make it fiction, they say, and that way no one will ever know what they're talking about. Or they'll hide it in poetry and disguise their story in a villanelle. They'll write it as a one-act play, they'll take a pseudonym, they'll joke about going into witness protection. Not one of these possibilities will work. When it comes to these crucial stories, they will be told and be told slant or told straight, because they must be. Every family has a core legend, a cone, a defining, foundational, sometimes cryptic narrative around which its generations are coiled. Left unresolved, it will pop relentlessly back to the surface like a rubber bath toy. It is the story that appears when we least expect it, in primary relationships, both successful and failed, in parenthood, at work, in recovery meetings, in the patterns that our therapists tell us they see. It is an endless loop, a thin Mobius strip that vibrates like a guitar string. This is mine. My paternal grandmother was a calmly frosted-haired, thick browed elfin woman who left her Central European country in 1900 when she was 2, who cared for me and saved my life when I was deathly ill as a teenager, who padded across her linoleum-floored Coney Island kitchen in gold vinyl ballet-style slippers every morning and night, who had been a child prodigy making a town hall appearance playing Chopin when she was 14, who played half and a dollar poker, who had a salty, ribald sense of humor, who loved to laugh, who had a tiny gambling addiction, who made a nice brisket and a decent chicken and matzo balls as heavy as lead weights, who lit Sabbath candles every Friday night, and who, when my father was 3 and my aunt 8, almost a century ago, abandoned them. I'll stop there. Thank you.
So what made you decide to take it from this story of your family, from 8 lines in one of your earlier books, to really the catalyst for this entire book? What was that decision like? And after your cousin, confronted you, did that bring more fear in you or more trepidation about kind of telling the story in a bigger way?
I still have so much trepidation about it that we were sitting in the green room and I was chewing on my fingers that one of my family members was going to show up because she lives in Alexandria. And I was going to be like, what am I going to do? This could get very bad. So it was a long process, it was a long process. And there was a huge amount of shaming involved. When I was confronted about it, I was shocked. I was really shocked because, like I said, in my family, it was common knowledge, talked about it all the time. It was open on the, it was on the, like, we talked about it over dinner. And I felt that I could not be held responsible for, a secret that I did not know was a secret. But she didn't see it that way. She didn't see it that way. And so that was 2013, and I wrote that first essay for Krista Tippett in 2016. And those 3 years were probably the hardest 3 years I've ever experienced, both as a creative who makes my living as who makes her living as a creative, and just as a person trying to put one foot in front of the other every day and looking in the mirror going, oh my God, what did you do? Because I do believe that writers have to take responsibility for the words we use and for the things that we say and for the way in which we say them. It took a long time, and after that essay came out, I started writing more essays about it, and it was showing up in everything I was writing. It was showing up in everything I was teaching. I described trying to avoid the topic like trying to stuff a live octopus into a pillowcase. You can't do it. And I realized, as I started teaching more and more, that this was an issue that everybody faced to one degree or another. And everybody wanted to talk about it, but nobody was talking about it because everybody was petrified. I had one student who was a very, very well-known novelist, National Book Award-winning novelist. You would all know her. And she showed up in one of my workshops, and I was like, oh, what are you doing here? And brilliant writer, created, wonderful work in class. And then when it was over, I said, so are you actually at active work on a memoir? And she said, yeah, but I could never submit it. And I said, why? And she said, because my family will just, vaporize. And I said, well, where are they? And she said, oh, they've been dead for 150 years. So these things, this like shame-cloaked stories have tentacles. They're foundational. They go way back. And but I realized that people wanted to talk about them, and my students wanted to talk about them. And so that was when I started thinking about the whole thing as a larger question, as a bigger project.
So I think you're right. I think this is something that not just writers, but everyone faces of, can I tell this story, especially when there is something like shame associated with it. So how do you reconcile truth with all the versions of reality that others, and especially family, might hold? How do you stand firm enough and say, this is my story? Is it a version? Is the truth fixed? Is it different for every person? How do you kind of reconcile those two things when everyone has their own version of what the truth is?
Right, yes, and that is a core issue. And, I always say that when you can put 5 adult siblings around a dinner table and say to them, do you remember that Christmas in 1975 when Dad got drunk on the Jim Beam? And every one of them will have a different version of the story, including one who will say, Dad didn't drink. And it's not really a problem, but the problem is that every one of those stories, every one of those truths is a viable truth, because we all see the world, we all experience the world through the lens of our own experience and through our own context and what we bring to the table. There can only be one empirical fact, right? The sky is blue, although to some people maybe it's not, but we won't go there. But when you say that to people, they're like, yeah, that happens in my family all the time when we get together. And for me, when I realized that that's okay, it's okay for people to have different versions, just as long as they do not tell you that it is the version, and that you're wrong and you've gotten it wrong and you've gotten it wrong your entire life. Humans are, as you may have noticed, we're heavily invested in being right. We have to be right. About the way, Grandma spiced the roast chicken, I've heard people argue about those things, like mud wrestle over them. So, what I have tried to do for myself, but also with my students, is explain that it's really okay it's not binary. It's not, this is right and this is wrong. And it's very hard to get people comfortable with that idea, to get students comfortable with that idea, much less their families,
So what types of stories do we not have permission to tell, if any?
Okay, so we do not have permission to tell stories that do not in any way belong to us, okay? So humans don't live in a vacuum. We do not live in a cave. We don't live in caves. Our lives bump up against the lives of other people, and that is just the way it is, that we overlap like a Venn diagram, right? But, and this is a big but, if you are a writer and you are faced with a really incredible story, a story of transcendence and love and any permutation of those things, but it has nothing to do with you. It has no connection to your family, no connection to your experience. It's just a great story, but it belongs to someone else, and you can't metabolize it, for your own experience. That's not your story to tell. If a story touches you directly, makes you who you are, changes who you are fundamentally, changes your worldview, the way you think about, your place on this rock, then it's yours to tell. Then it's yours to tell. And people will say, no, it's not, but it is, and it has to be. It has to be. And it's incredibly hard and incredibly complicated to get to a place where you tell that person who's saying, nope, no, it's not, you're a fabricator, it's not the way it happened, blah, 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 blah. It's very hard to tell them, this is what happened to me, and this is my experience, and I'm going to tell the story. Because very often they still won't accept it. So, yeah.
Did writing this book change your perspective of what your truth is of the story of your family?
It did. I mean, I did not expect, when I was writing it, one of the questions that came up, and it came up while I was writing it, was, it was the realization that my grandmother had left in 1926, and no one had asked why. No one asked why. Was it spousal abuse? Was she in love with somebody else? My grandmother was a brilliant classical pianist, and when she married my grandfather, that stopped. And I remember having a conversation with two students, one male and one female, and the guy said, well, she left because, the woman said she left because of art, because she wanted to find a way to make art, to play her music. And the guy said, I think she left because she's a monster. So it was, so there's been that. And, I also, when I realized this, that nobody had ever asked, everybody turned her into a pariah, nobody asked, I wanted to give her back her voice. She died in 1990, I think. No one ever knew. If someone knew, they never said. If her daughter knew, they never said. My father never said. But to understand, and then I started digging more deeply into stories about mothers who leave, like Doris Lessing, and there's even a Dolly Parton song that I refer to in the book called "To Daddy," and it so unravels me whenever I hear it. I can't listen to it, But it changed, so it changed my view of her, and it also changed the way I saw my family as, first I thought, unforgiving and certainly a little bit unkind. And then I realized that there had been this veneer of perfection that had been created around them, and I had cracked that veneer. And I had never realized that nobody cracked their veneer, but I did, and here we are all these years later. So,
I mean, your book has such personal experiences in it, and you talk about a lot of different members of your family, but especially with your mother, you write with a lot of honesty, but also compassion. And what you just said about your grandmother made me think of that of, most people are not binary good or bad. And your grandmother may have done a thing that a lot of people perceive as bad or monstrous, right? But she had dimensions, and she had layers, and she had motivations and feelings that we don't know anything about. How do you balance that compassion and while still trying to be true and honest that she did a horrible thing that a lot of people are going to have a lot of feelings on?
Right. Whoever we are and whatever we do, with the exception of some people, we are human. And, there's a wonderful teacher of memoir and also a brilliant memoirist herself, Vivian Gornick. And Vivian Gornick wrote a great book called The Situation in the Story. And in that book, she writes, for the drama to deepen, we need to see the loneliness of the monster and the cunning of the innocent. And I have that tacked above my desk because no one is all bad or all good. It's just impossible, I think that the process of writing, certainly writing this book, but also Motherland and other memoirs, if a memoirist doesn't come through the practice, through the writing of a book, and get to the other side of it, having experienced some level of transcendence and seeing that person, we all have that person, seeing that person in a different light with more compassion. They need to go back to working on it. Doesn't mean that you have to love them. It doesn't mean that you have to trust them. It doesn't mean any of those things. But you do have to strive to understand their intent and their motivation and your own for wanting to write the book to begin with, you know.
So I have two more questions and then we can throw it to the audience. But for lack of a better phrase, was writing your story worth all of the pain that you had to go through, the exile from your family, the missing out on milestones? You know, you talk about babies are born that will never know you exist, that you'll never meet. How do you weigh those two things with this strong need to let the octopus tentacles out and let the octopus swim and be free with the consequences that you've suffered because of it?
You know, I've often thought long and hard, you know, if I had to do it all over again, would I do it? And I know that there are writers here, and I think that when we have to write something, we almost have no choice in the matter. And if it doesn't come out one way, it's going to come out another way. And so that's one part of it. If I hadn't written that book, it would have shown up somewhere else. I am almost positive of that. Because as I said, it was the family cone. You know, it was the question around, the story around which my family was coiled, you know. Everything that we did, and things began to click into place like in a kaleidoscope, like, oh, that's why she, you know, is so hell-bent on perfection. That's why she does this. That's why she does that. And that was really important for me to learn. It was also really important for me to learn that I was not the person I thought I was in the pecking order, in the family. And that was impossibly difficult. And I still have trouble with that. But thank God for therapists.
Amen.
I mean, that was, you know, when I'm 61, I went through most of my life believing I had a certain kind of relationship with these people. And had I, in fact, I don't think that what happened would have happened. So there's that.
Well, and I'm paraphrasing, but I love the line in the book kind of directed toward your cousin of, you say, I don't have permission to tell it, or it's not my story, but why is it yours? Mm-hmm. Or why is it yours to keep and not mine to tell? Yeah.
I mean, you know, I think that every family, every, you know, situation, especially every family has a keeper of the keys. The person who says yay and the person who says nay. And everybody follows in line, like, you know, lines up behind that person. Usually they're a frightening person. That was true in my case. But, you know, she had devoted most of her life into crafting this facade of perfection, this veneer of perfection. And here I came along and I cracked it. And it crazed like porcelain, you know. And I'm sure that was nothing that she ever expected. And it was nothing that I ever intended, you know. So, yeah.
So what advice would you give to anyone out here, or what do you say to your students who are struggling to tell their story for fear of family or friends challenging, exiling, you know, having a completely different version of their story? What do you say to them?
I say to them, spend a lot of time thinking about intent and motivation. Think about revenge writing. If it's revenge, don't do it. It's a very bad idea. It's creatively a very bad idea. Revenge writing results in flat stories and flat characters, like, like stick figures. And you do not want to drag your reader into the quicksand of trauma with you, and not be able to pull them out with you. And while I don't believe in necessarily writing for your reader, I think it's something that you have to consider. So you write your manuscript, you write your story, you write your essay, and then take a giant step back from it and think about intention and think about motivation. Why do I want to do this? What are the stakes? What are the risks? You could write the most beautiful thing in the world and get to those questions and not have valid answers for them. And that happens too. I mean, I've written plenty of things that will never see the light of day because I just don't think they should, But at the end of the day, if it is your story and it has touched you personally, it has made you who you are, it's your story to write.
Okay, I want to open it up to questions from the audience. We have a staff member who will bring a mic around to you so we can make sure we hear you. But yeah, right in front.
Well, thank you so much, Elissa. It was so nice to hear you reading, and I really enjoyed the introduction.
Thank you.
And I have always enjoyed your class. Obviously, it was.
Thank you.
It was a wonderful time for me to be in your class. You mentioned something about who owns the story, but we know that in fiction, so many people, especially so many famous writers, like they use other people's stories and tell it in their fiction. I know that, like, for example, Carol Oates, I know that people say that she, like those stories, she's like, use it from other people. So, but that's the shady thing, how can you can say a story which is completely from other people, but they still do it, Maybe if you're saying it from the ethical standpoint, like what you feel, your own self, but we see that this happens all the time.
It does happen all the time, and I think that it certainly happens in fiction all the time. I'm not a writer of fiction. I've tried. I don't have the fictive impulse. Maybe someday, but I think that fiction marches to the beat of its own drummer. I think that there are different rules for fiction, although I have had many students who have just said, I'm just going to change the names and make the, I was doing an event the other night with Anne Lamott, and she was hilarious, as you would think, and she said that if you change somebody's height and hair color, they're never going to recognize themselves. And I don't know that that's true. But I think that fiction is it's a different beast. I think it's a different practice and a different art. And maybe it's more accepted as the norm in fiction. I don't know. You're a brilliant writer of fiction, so I mean, you could speak to it more accurately than I could. But I do think that they're different, and I think the rules are different. I hope that's okay.
There was a fiction writing scholarship through Amtrak several years ago.
We were just talking about that. That's right.
Literally, you just overhear conversations that other people are having
Right.
and then write stories about it. I mean, they were paying people to just I think it was maybe, 3 months where you just go up and down on the Amtrak. So I do think it's a lot more accepted if you're, not going to use that person's name,
Right.
Specific names that they say out loud, maybe
Right.
turn it into fiction.
Yeah.
Then it's fair game.
Yeah. I think Karen Carbo was the first person to do that. Yes.
It was tempting.
Yeah.
It sounds fun.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Yeah.
I have a related question. I was mulling over the lines you read in your book about students who want to use a pseudonym, write poetry, write a play, write fiction, and then you asked a question about writing fiction, and you kind of mentioned this again. But I think you said in the book that all those efforts would fail. Could you elaborate on why that is, and especially for somebody who does write in those genres already? Would this still fail to try those things?
You know, I would caution against using the word fail, because I don't think that we fail. I think that things that we want to write inevitably come out differently, or they wind up being something else. And it may be that way, that, you know, that can be considered a failure, but it's not. I think that the work that we do, the writing that we do, in whatever form it is, inevitably takes on a life of its own. So I'm going to mangle this quote, but James Baldwin famously said that writers write the same stories over and over, and you know the quote, right? Over and over again. And until the stories are, you know, we're like fated to do that. And until the stories become bigger and smaller and clearer. And I think that that's certainly, for me, it's certainly very accurate. And for most writers I know, you know, I have poet friends who cannot get away from the story that they need to tell. You know, if you are writing about something that happened, the thing, you know, I always call it the thing that happened, no matter what form it appears in, and how a writer will attempt to disguise it or cloak it in some way, it's like the octopus in the pillowcase. If the whole thing doesn't come out, parts of it are going to come out, you know. And I really stand by that. I stand by that. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Yeah. So, did you ever have a chance to see your grandmother, or?
Oh yeah,
Okay.
yeah. And you know, the question was, did I ever have a chance to see my grandmother? And she was the grandmother that I wasn't super close to. I was very close to the other one, but she was a very quiet woman, and she was a little bit mysterious. She was easily moved to tears at strange times, you know. And towards the end of her life, she had lost all of her hearing, and she still could sit down at a piano and play a middle C and say, it needs to be tuned, you know. So, but I wasn't super close to her. But now, of course, I'm really curious. And now all of, you know, her children are gone. My father and my aunt are both gone. And their children won't, you know, my aunt's children won't talk about it. So it's, you know, it's a mystery. And I always think, you know, well, if I was going to write fiction, would that be where I started? I don't know.
Yeah, in the back.
Hi.
She's going to bring you a microphone.
She does. No.
Okay. All right. So this is my first time seeing the book, and I'm excited to read it. So I know nothing about it other than what I've heard just now. And I'm a reporter. So my question to you is, how much, if any, reporting did you do about your grandmother? And did you investigate anybody who might have known her, or newspaper articles, or did you go on, you know, Ancestry or any of that?
I did go on Ancestry. That's really interesting. I did go on Ancestry because when the book came out and the conversations were starting to happen, that's my grandmother, and there she is now. and there she is now. You know, the cousin at issue tried to tell her children that it wasn't grandma who left, it was grandpa who left, because mothers don't leave, right? So she tried to change that. Then I was told that it was 3 years. Then I was told that it was 4 years. So Ancestry.com, a very easy, membership, and I looked her up in the census, and I found her living with my father, I found my father and my aunt and my grandfather living as boarders as late as 1930. So that was undeniable, I also, because I'm an only child, during the war, my father and my grandmother wrote letters back and forth to each other constantly. My father was in the Pacific and as a fighter pilot. And so I inherited all of his letters, but I also inherited her letters back to him. So I inherited these complete conversations, and sometimes it was hard to organize them by date and question, and, but I, in 1990 to 1990 to 91, I lived for 18 months in my grandmother's apartment after a breakup. And my father and my aunt kept the apartment because it was $142 a month. And big surprise, when I moved in, I discovered that after she died, they had left everything as it was. It was like a time capsule. So there was food in the refrigerator. There was, a box of coffee nips on the end table. Her clothes were still hanging in the closet. It was a little bit creepy, a little bit weird. And to them, they didn't want her to leave again. And so when she died, they didn't remove any of her things. And they didn't tell me that was what was going to be facing me when I walked in that day. But what I did find were bags of these letters. Some of them, were censored by the military, by the military, and I still have them, and I try to organize them as best I can, and I keep them in archival boxes in my office. And those really helped a lot. I mean, that was as much as I could do, because she died when she was 93, and she was like the last of her group. So there was really nobody left. My father's sister was a woman of, I don't know, I would say she was a woman of terror. Would you say that? And I was not super close to her. And so it would never have occurred to me to talk to her anyway about this, because it was 8 lines in a memoir, in an innocuous memoir. But I learned a lot from the letters. I learned a lot from the letters. Letters are a gold mine. So.
I have one more question. I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't bring up this cover, because I just find it so striking and so beautiful. And I look around at all the face-outs here on the bookshelves, and this is just really pure art.
Thank you.
And so I just wanted to ask how much, I'm always interested in how much the authors have say over the cover and what it represents to you. And
well, I was a book publisher for many years, and I know what goes into making a cover, and I know the marketing department, throwing rotten tomatoes at each other, and it can be ugly. And that one person who says, "I don't know, it doesn't speak to me," and you have to start from scratch. I've had odd experiences with covers in the past. This book was published by a smaller literary press, and they do beautiful, beautiful work. But I got the email. I was out walking the dog. I came home and I got the email that said, "Attached are your cover samples," and I was like, I don't want to open them, because I didn't know what I was going to find, And I took a deep breath, and I did, and that was what they had sent me. And if you don't like it, we can do this. And I was like, "What? Are you kidding me?" And Susan my wife is a book designer for Random House, interior book designer, and a wonderful, and has done covers as well. And so I sent it to her at the other end of the house where she works. And she was like, oh my God, it's gorgeous, you know? And I had no input. I didn't make any suggestions about anything. I didn't say, oh, a peach in a birdcage. Didn't say that. And this is what came of it. And I was blown away by it. I really was. And I'm very grateful to them because I think they've done an amazing job across the board. So.
It's really beautiful. That's very lucky. I have some friends who have gotten some
really dismal.
Yes, it can be a dark time in an author's life.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Well, Elissa, thank you so much for the conversation.
Thank you.
You all so much for coming. If you would like to get your book signed, our signing table is right here. There are plenty of copies at the register.
I mean, you took part of my spiel.
Okay, sorry. I used to do this for a living, you know.
Thank you all so much for coming to tonight's event at Politics and Prose. As she mentioned, if you're interested in purchasing a copy of the book, we have several available at the front.